Great to be here. I'm here to moderate, as was said, the next session. And the purpose of this next session is to ask, or to start thinking about how we can build a 21st century approach to taking on poverty. And the two speakers today will be discussing in particular how poverty might be reduced by exploiting some of the data that are going to become available via the National Poverty Study, which will be going to field in 2019. So I'm very pleased to welcome Jeff Cohen, Professor of Psychology here at Stanford, also the James G. March Professor of Organizational Studies in Education and Business, and a leader in devising field experimentation for the purposes of taking on pressing problems. I'm also pleased to welcome Emma Brunskill, Assistant Professor of Computer Science here at Stanford, and part of the Stanford AI for Human Impact Lab, and a leader in figuring out how to leverage data to improve decision making. So I'll leave it at that. I think Jeff and Emma will start off with some slides, but want to leave some time open for discussion. So Jeff first.
Thanks so much for inviting us here today. As David introduced, what we're trying to do is combine behavioral science and data science to get a better handle on a really big problem, that of poverty. If you think about poverty, it's astonishing to think that over about 20 million Americans survive on less than $9 a day in America. And that means they struggle daily to find food, stay warm and safe, and preserve their dignity every day, day in, day out. This is a major, major problem. We're a team of data scientists, behavioral scientists, medical scientists, who want to kind of combine our expertise to fight a new smart war on poverty. So why do we care about poverty? Obviously, it's a big moral imperative. As the wealthiest nation on earth, it is a travesty that so many people would be living in such dire straits. So one imperative is moral, but of course another is also economic. Poverty is also very expensive. We spend about $1 trillion a year on anti-poverty programs. That's almost 1/4 of the federal budget. And then there's another almost $1 trillion in foregone employment and medical costs and other externalities. But because the problem is so large at such a scale that even tiny reductions in it could have an outsized effect. For example, if we could just move the needle on poverty just a little bit, just reducing the number in poverty by 1%, that would transform roughly 3 million American lives. And calculations suggest it would also increase GDP by $54 billion. So what's our approach here that we want to use to fight this smart war on poverty? We want to use not a coarse approach, but a more precise approach, like a scalpel. And we want to bring the tools of big science to bear. And in thinking about this and grappling with this issue, we were inspired by lessons in another field, that of precision medicine. And we're bringing some of those lessons of precision medicine here, not to sort of dictate treatments, but to create a kind of recommendation engine that could inform social workers, psychiatrists, policymakers in their approach to poverty. So what we're doing is we're taking these lessons from precision medicine, and there are three. The first is we need research to make a dent in many diseases ranging from cancer to cystic fibrosis. It took a massive research expenditure. We need the same thing in poverty. Second, because of this commitment, we realized something super important, that what had seemed like one big monolithic problem like cancer was actually many problems in disguise, each with its own etiology. We think the same lesson could be applied here to poverty, that poverty isn't one thing, it's many things, and understanding its complex etiology in each case could help us to intervene more effectively. And the third lesson from precision medicine is this hope of personalized treatment, the notion that if we could intervene more precisely, give people exactly the kind of treatment they need, when they need it, where they need it, at this key sort of point in a complex system of maximal leverage, a little bit might go a long way. Precisely targeting treatments to the kind of diagnostic classification that's at work in a particular case. And that's our goal with using data science, computer science, to try to get a more nuanced, more heterogeneous, and more precise view of the problem of poverty. And as David said, we're doing this in the context of the National Poverty Study. I'm going to go through this real quick so Emma can get up here and tell you more about the nuts and bolts. But this is a National Poverty Study headed by Dave Grusky and Kathy Eden and all of us, their colleagues. Here, this is a big national study where we're getting, we have a corpse that is fanning out across the country to get a huge representative sample of people in poverty. So we have a representative sample at baseline. And then what we're going to do is to collect data at multiple levels of analysis for the first time. Not just the individual characteristics and traits in biology, but their ecology, their social environment, their neighborhood, as well as institutional data about the availability of jobs and resources to get a more nuanced picture of the life space that they exist in. So just by way of more specifics, what we're getting are these individual level data. We're hoping to get genomic and epigenetic data, but we have yet to get the funding for that, but we hope to. Psychological data on people's levels of trust, purpose, these sort of psychological constructs that behavioral scientists and psychologists have found to be so important. Soft skills, linguistic skills, cognitive skills, health data. So these individual level data, but also we're going to go up a level and get data on family, networks, and neighborhood. Things like the number of broken windows on the neighborhood using Google Images, getting a picture of the context and the predictability of the context and the amount of resources in the context. And of course, institutional level data such as social programs, jobs, labor market turnover, and environmental data. So we're trying to get a kind of multidisciplinary handle on the problem at baseline among a representative sample. Rather than starting top down with an intervention and thinking, we think this will work, like unconditional cash transfers, and we're just going to do it, we're going to try to get a heterogeneous and nuanced picture of the experience of poverty in its many, many forms. And the hope is that we can also connect these data with outcomes. And finally, what we're also doing is conducting an intervention. We're not just measuring, but we're manipulating. We're going to intervene. And this is just a proof of concept. We want to show that this kind of precision targeting is possible. Here we're drawing on research in the psychology department here at Stanford on mindset, self-affirmation, which has found that little nudges can go a long way. For example, give a person a chance to express their core values at a key moment. They can better handle stress, and sometimes better handling stress, they go on to more success. This has been shown in the context of schools and job performance. Just to give one example, this was a study done in England where they were looking at ways to increase minority number of minorities passing a test for becoming a constable in Great Britain. Minorities underperform. They tend to only 41% pass the exam for becoming a constable. But in a little nudge condition where the minority applicants had the chance to say what was most important to them and why they dreamed of becoming a constable, that percentage raised to 63%. So little affirming nudges could go a long way. We think maybe the same thing could work in the context of poverty. Not for everyone, but some people might be kind of like super responders. That little nudge might tip them over onto the cusp of a different trajectory from the one they would otherwise have had. And the idea is that for people who have resources, who have opportunities to advance themselves at least a little bit, a little psychological nudge could go a long way to put them on a better track. And we hope to use the tools of data science, not just to classify the different forms of poverty, but to get a handle on treatment heterogeneity, to be better able to predict who, when, and where is that kind of psychological nudge most effective. And then if we can target interventions more effectively with that psychological intervention, maybe we could do the same thing with other interventions. And that would mean that we could really make a dent on poverty, not by spending more money, but by using the money we have much more effectively. Let me turn it over to Emma, who's going to go into greater detail. Thanks.
Great, yeah, so building on what Jeff was just saying, one of the things that we're really excited about understanding here is what works for whom and when in order to try to make the best use that we have of our resources. And so one of the key questions here is, what is the heterogeneity in the treatment response? And of course, speaking to a medical audience, you guys are all equally well-versed or probably much more expert than me in some of these aspects. But I come to this from the perspective of a machine learning researcher, where people are increasingly thinking about how we can leverage the tools of machine learning to try to understand from existing data what works for whom and how we can best target potential interventions, just in the way that we're thinking about this for precision medicine. So in particular, when we think about precision treatments here, we're thinking about things like how, as we're starting to get better models, given a large amount of data, of whom is best impacted by different forms. Because as Jeff just mentioned, there's a lot of really exciting advances about how these additional sources of information can help people to sort of realize their best selves. And some of these things can be thought of as providing people with different information to interpret their own circumstances. So for example, one of my favorite papers from my Stanford colleagues looks at things like belonging, which is telling people that some of the experiences that they might be interpreting as indicating personal characteristics, like for example, failing your first midterm, meaning that you don't belong at Stanford, in fact, are part of the universal experience of freshmen. And so that by giving people alternative theories and understandings of their own context, it can allow them to make use of office hours, externalize some of the hardships that they are experiencing now, and give them different tools and opportunities and allow them to make use of those. So from that perspective, we're hoping to use this existing data set to try to better understand who and when these sort of interventions can work and who these super responders might be. Now, one thing I want to emphasize here is that as we sort of get this data, then we can use it to target interventions and target resources perhaps in a more effective way, and in particular identify for whom things are effective and for whom they might not be effective. One question you might have for those of you in the audience that perhaps might be experts in things like heterogeneous treatment estimation, which is certainly a big area in fields like epidemiology or medical statistics, is why do you need a computer scientist in the room? This is a well-studied area. It's been well-studied for a long time. I think one of the reasons that I'm so excited about it is because we're starting to see, just in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, a huge interest in the machine learning community of combining the ideas of machine learning with causal inference. So in particular, you don't need to understand this particular graph, but essentially, this is a diagram of a deep neural network. As most of you know, and as we heard about before, deep neural networks have been transforming things like image search, whether or not we know whether something is a donut or a cat. But they also have huge implications for better understanding things like poverty and medicine. And in particular, one of the most exciting fields to me right now is coupling these sort of advances, these really sort of flexible ways to try to predict outcomes, with trying to make counterfactual reasoning inferences of what might happen for certain individuals if we were to provide them with different forms of treatments. How can we use this information not just to make predictions, but to make decisions? And I think this sort of marriage of the really exciting advances in deep learning, along with a huge, rich history of causal inference, is one of the most promising frontiers right now in computer science. So that's one of the reasons I was so excited to be part of this project. I think it has huge implications for medicine, and it certainly has huge implications for hopefully alleviating poverty as well. Another thing I just wanted to touch on briefly in this context, particularly given this workshop, is just that as we are doing these type of inferences, we want to be very aware of the limitations of these techniques. So there's increasing awareness and concern right now of the implications of making these sort of recommendations in terms of whether they could accidentally aggravate disparities or bias. And you've probably seen a lot of this in the news. And I just want to emphasize that's something that we're actively considering as part of this project as well. Just as a brief recap for some of you about why this might occur when we start to use machine learning to make recommendations about what interventions might work for different people. Machine learning, to encapsulate it in a single slide, tends to be summarized by a combination of data and an objective. So do we want to be able to recognize whether or not an image is a cat or not? And so we input a whole bunch of data plus our objective, and we throw it into our black box machine learning, and something comes out. And so from this perspective, bias might occur for at least two reasons. One might be that the data that we have right now is biased. If you're doing something like a randomized controlled trial, which we are right now for the poverty data, this is less of a concern because we are actively randomizing who receives interventions. But when you start to use observational data, this can be a significant concern. But the second issue is the objective. What are we actually telling the algorithm to do? And it turns out that some of our existing techniques kind of can amplify biases that exist, even if in an unintentional way. And so one of the big focuses right now in our community is thinking about fairness and how do we ensure fairness and how do we detect bias and how do we mitigate that. And I just want to mention that there's active work both by my group and other groups and thinking about this when we try to start making these decisions about what treatments might affect people and whether or not there might be bias in those. So for example, one of the ways to try to mitigate this is to change the objective that machine learning algorithms are trying to accomplish by saying that we want solutions that not only might help reduce poverty, but do so in a way that is fair and equitable for everybody. So in particular, one of our first forays into this was thinking about it from the supervised learning perspective, which is we're not yet making decisions, but we're trying to make important predictions that could influence decisions in the context of things like college admissions and whether or not there's systematic biases against particular groups such as females versus males. And in this particular data set we were looking at here, we were trying to do things like predict GPA from pre-college scores. And you might imagine this is important because these sort of predictors could be used to make admissions decisions about who gets into college. And what we were curious about is whether existing methods could kind of systematically over or under predict for women. So it might be the case that women systematically do better in college and men do worse. And in that case, it would be okay if our algorithm reflects that reality. What we want to make sure is that the algorithms do not systematically over-predict for one group and under-predict for another relative to the true baseline. So for example, if women on average get a 3.5, I shouldn't always predict they get a 3.7 and give an extra lift to one group that does not exist at the penalty of another group. So one of the things we found is that a lot of the existing algorithms, which are the three ones on the left, were systematically over-predicting for men and under-predicting for women relative to their true outcomes. But by changing the machine learning algorithms and developing new techniques, we could find methods that are over on the right, which constrain how much bias we can have in our machine learning output. So I think this is a first step. There's a number of my other colleagues who are also working on this, and we're going to try to do similar innovations for the context of these sort of heterogeneous treatment estimations so that we can make sure we can make recommendations for new individuals that both hopefully will improve their poverty status and to do so in a way that is fair and equitable across all of the groups. So just to summarize, we're happy to answer questions after this. I think one of the really exciting things to me about this is to think about how can we view poverty in the same way that we now view much of medicine, in the sense of it being a very rich, complex problem where we'll need lots of different solutions and that we can leverage big data in order to try to make the best recommendations for everyone that then can be used by other domain experts in order to inform what is the best treatment going forward. Thank you.
I think we have like 3 minutes for questions. We didn't do as well as we wanted, but we have some time. So maybe Geoff and Emma can take any questions you might have.
I saw that most of your work and data is really for the US, and I'm just wondering about parts of the world where poverty, absolute poverty is a real problem, not just relative poverty. And so I'm wondering whether the techniques that you're using, is it a problem of the applicability, the general applicability of the techniques, or just your particular personalized focus?
I think the technique is a general technique that could be used in many different contexts to understand many different kinds of poverties in different cultures. My feeling is that we take a bottom-up approach, and so what's really critical is just that whatever models we create are actually based on the data from that place, those people. So it would be a mistake, for instance, to create models and predictive algorithms based on a US sample and try to generalize that to an entirely different culture. But I think the general approach of improved classification, precision targeting, and just kind of a research investment to really understand the etiology of different forms of poverty is kind of like an approach that could be generalized in many different contexts.
So, great presentations. Dave and I had talked about the life cycle of poverty, and how could you use the data that banks hold on credit quality and life cycle conditions to marry up with this approach so that it's more of a continuity from their perspective of loans that have to be written off and how to avoid that?
I think it would be great to integrate with longer-term measures. I know that we're already planning to continue to follow up with a lot of the people that participate in this study so that we get long-term measures with them so that we can track it not just from a single time step but across a lot of time. I will just mention in terms of banks, I think one challenge there is that it's not generally randomized control trials, so there often can be additional observational information that's being used to make those. The best paper this year actually at the International Conference on Machine Learning was exactly discussing the issue of how do we get fair machine learning algorithms when the decisions that are made could either amplify or decrease inequalities going forward using FICO scores. So it's clearly a rich area of opportunity.
Right there. That's the last one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I love this work. I think it's very exciting, but what would you say to someone who says you're basically empowering the surveillance state to basically measure poverty and collect huge amounts of data about people who are already the victims of discrimination?
That's a really good question. I think that's a great topic for conversation. It's one that we all have been thinking about and grappling with. I mean, the most important thing for us as a research institution is that everything is approved by the Institutional Review Board and the data are kept secure and safe at all times, unlike other contexts such as industry, where the kind of surveillance state is already here and already sharing your data. What we are trying to do is to use these data to provide better support to people in need. And we take great steps to protect the security of the data at all times. We have decades of experience. That's the thing about being at a research institution like this one, working in this field, is we get really trained up on how to protect data for lifetimes and keep the participants safe.
And both to protect, but also to conduct ethical research. As Jeff just mentioned, unlike in a lot of industry, we go through both training for ethics as well as the things always have to be passed through an ethical board, just like in a lot of medical research. So the costs and benefits always have to be weighed.
Thank you. Thank you. Please join me panel. The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.